Hello, friends. Recently, Luke and I were lucky enough to speak with Granada series writer Gary Hopkins. Now, we've not yet encountered Gary's work on the series, as he was responsible for penning numerous later episodes, including The Devil's Foot, Shoscombe Old Place, The Golden Pince-Nez, and The Mazarin Stone. But our conversation was good fun and pretty insightful. So instead of waiting until we reached those distant episodes, we thought we'd go ahead and release the interview now. After all, 'tis the season. Gary's had a pretty stellar career, writing for shows like Emmerdale, Dramarama, El Dorado, and Doctors. Nowadays, he's part of the radio show Nostalgia Ain't What It Used to Be on Bristol BCFM 93.2. Our interview was recorded over Skype, so apologies for any glitches or overeager volumes. But our excitement aside, I think you'll find the conversation with Gary to be a rare glimpse into the making of the Granada series, from the writer's point of view. Now, this interview would not have been possible without the help and generosity of a very close friend of the show, Mr. David Ewell, who near single-handedly was able to shepherd this interview to fruition. So, David, thanks again, man. So with that, we give you our conversation with Gary Hopkins. Gary, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really just an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk to you for a few minutes.
You're very welcome.
Well, let's start at the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning. Were you a Sherlockian as a lad? How young were you when you first read the stories?
Well, quite young. I grew up on a diet of television Sherlock Holmes, played by Peter Cushing, and of course Basil Rathbone in the movies. And in fact, the 1959 Hammer film starring Peter Cushing was one of my favourite Hammers. And actually, as a child, just terrified me. So, that was my start really. But I was an early reader. I enjoyed literature from very early on. And because of the accessibility of Conan Doyle, that was something I got into quite early. I think probably 8, 9, 10 years old. And I can remember some of my earliest train journeys. And we're talking about the sort of early carriage trains, the corridor trains, which you see in movies, where as a family we used to go on what used to be called mystery trips, which were just to very anonymous seaside resorts, but it involved a corridor train. And I can remember very vividly sitting in a carriage in those trains reading Sherlock Holmes, particularly things like The Hound of the Baskervilles. Just the atmosphere of the books was sort of echoed by what I could see outside the train window, and the fact that the trains themselves were from what appeared to be a previous period. And, so the whole thing was atmospheric. I loved the mood of it. And that was, in fact, that was my reason for agreeing to go on those trips, that I could just sit there the entire time reading things like Conan Doyle. And it was Sherlock Holmes, but it also included things like The Lost World. But there was this amazing world of escapism that I wanted to tap into. And at that age, it was the perfect thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's great. You came on for The Devil's Foot, but when did you first see the Granada series? Did you watch it from the beginning? Were you a fan?
From the beginning, yeah. I was certainly aware of the series. I'd only begun. That was 1984, I think, in the UK. I'd only recently started in the business. I was very young. I started at the age of 21, writing scripts for television professionally. And so by 1984, I was quite aware of everything that was going on television at the time. And Sherlock Holmes was a big, big production. I don't remember it being massively publicised, but I do remember that people within the industry were very excited about what it was, and the fact that Jeremy Brett had been cast as Sherlock Holmes, being a big-name Hollywood actor who'd done a lot of television, but was primarily known as a film actor. So we had this amazing performer coming in to play something that was something that he wasn't particularly known for. Mm-hmm. So it was an intriguing piece of casting. But having said that, it was an exciting piece of casting. So I do remember watching those first episodes with great interest. There was at that point no sign at all, no particular indication that I would be working on the series. It was way out of my league. But I'd done a bit of television at that point, fairly low budget things. And I just thought this was such an exciting new piece of television. I mean, the fact it looked so filmic and was so atmospheric and did tap into those things I was talking about earlier as a young lad sitting in a corridor train carriage reading this wonderful stuff. So, I just wanted to watch these episodes and soak them up. And they were terrific. They were absolutely terrific. And it wasn't until about 2 years or so into the run that I thought, actually, I enjoy this so much, I might try and write one myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was just an exercise in having a go. There was nothing attached to it. There was certainly no commission. There was nobody saying to me, "Why don't you try this? Because it might be interesting. It might be useful to your career." There was no sense of that at all. It was just something I thought this would be nice to do.
Yeah.
And I quite liked the style of the series, the fact that they had flashbacks. It was just a fresh take on the whole thing. And I just thought, yeah, I could do this. I think I could actually do something interesting with it.
And you certainly did. I mean, that must have been something of a dream come true for a young writer to get your script accepted in that way. I mean, I guess I'd like to dive a little deeper. I mean, the story of you sending that script in is pretty famous, but I'm curious to know what happened in the in between time. Were you agonizing? Were you wondering if anything was going to happen, or did you just put it out into the world and then think, whatever comes?
No, I agonised massively. I submitted the script, and I think I didn't hear anything for quite a long time. And I suspect at that stage I'd probably just given it up, thinking this isn't going to happen. It was a nice idea, and I did what I wanted to do, and that's fine. But it's been filed in the bin, and I wasn't going to hear anything else. And then months down the line, lo and behold, I had a letter from June Wyndham-Davis, the producer at that time of Sherlock, who had taken over from Michael Cox as producer. And I still have the letter to this day. I don't have it with me to hand. I should have brought it with me. But it was a very simple, very short letter in which she said something like, "Thank you very much for your script submission. We've read it. We are very excited about it. And by absolute coincidence, we are looking to produce The Devil's Foot in the next series of Sherlock Holmes. And since we like your script so much, we think we'll produce that one."
Wow.
I thought that I saw the stamp on the letter saying it was from Granada Television, and I thought it was just another one of many rejections I'd received over a period of years. But this was the one. This was the one that changed everything for me.
Yeah,
That's great.
That's a great story, man. That's every writer's dream come true.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know the story well enough. You know where this went.
Yeah.
Not only was it produced, but it went on to win an award. So
Yeah.
it was one of those things that every writer dreams of. It's certainly something that you'd like to happen more than once, but even if it just happens the once, it's a great thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. No, I want to talk about all the episodes that you wrote, but let's dig into Devil's Foot for just a moment.
Sure.
There's a lot of information out there, but I'm always curious to dig a little deeper. I know that you had hoped that Eric Porter could make an appearance in the episode, and I guess originally he was written in to have an actual part or an appearance in the dream sequence, in the hallucination sequence. Is that right?
Well, the way that happened is that when I wrote the script, as I've already indicated, I wrote it without any knowledge or any expectation that it would actually be produced. So I could basically do anything I wanted with it. So that there were no production limitations.
Sure.
There was nobody telling me you can't have Eric Porter because he's too expensive or not available, or it's just not very practical. So I wrote the whole sequence with Eric Porter in mind, because it just seemed the right thing to do at the time. And I can remember having a conversation with, I think it was both June and Michael, whether we could actually bring Eric back to do that sequence. So it wasn't outside the possibility that we could have done that. But in the end, I think they felt it was cheaper, probably the right decision, just to use existing footage and then just treat it in a way that made it look like a dreamscape.
Right. Well, so in this episode, there's a very famous moment where, and it's unique to this episode, it's unique to this series, where Sherlock calls his friend by the name John for the first and only time. But that wasn't in the original script, correct? That came about because Jeremy wanted to...
That was Jeremy. That was absolutely entirely Jeremy. Yes, it was written in the script pretty much as it was in the original story. Well, I reversed it because in the original story it was actually Watson who was affected by the drug, not Holmes.
Right.
But we thought we'd flip that round because it seemed like the right thing to do. Holmes was the one who was tampering with the experiment, so it made sense for him to be the one affected by it. And because of Watson's medical background, it made sense for him to be the one to bring him round. But when it came to actually putting that together, I think we did this in rehearsal, that Jeremy said, actually, I'm just going to call him John. And it was a moment of revelation. It was that moment of Sherlock Holmes being so vulnerable and so exposed, but and at the same time showing his real affection for Watson as a human being. It made perfect sense for him to call him by his first name.
Yeah, and it really is, it's a magical moment, it's one of those times when everything comes together just right. Legend has it that it was also Jeremy Brett who wanted to show Holmes kind of kicking the habit, and that he had to approach Dame Jean Conan Doyle for her blessing on that. How did that part come about? Again, like how late in the process were you making those kind of changes?
That was quite late. That was quite close to filming. But I think there had been some discussions during rehearsals where we talked about the drugs usage, and the opening scenes of the episode were all about his going on this break to recover from excessive usage. So thematically, it seemed to work that this would be the episode where, if he was ever going to kind of kick the habit, this would be the one where he'd try to do it. But it was completely Jeremy's idea to do that. We weren't going to go that far, but it was Jeremy who said, finally, I think this is the one where I have to let it go.
One of the things we do on the podcast a lot, I mean, we talk in the background and things, but then we always discuss just our favorite, Jeremy Brett moments from each episode. And one of my favorite moments from this episode is him very dramatically, burying the needle in the sand under about 2 inches of sand.
Yeah.
and I just thought,
Yeah.
I always think about that. There's just a needle in the beach somewhere, but then he also chucks a lamp off the cliff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of littering in this one.
Yeah, he's not being very considerate of the barefoot beachgoer.
No, it isn't. But I think symbolically it made the point.
Yes, definitely.
That he was burying it in a very kind of Oliver Hardy fashion, of very deliberately, very precisely, almost flamboyantly.
Very flamboyant.
Right.
Pushing the sand across the needle, but that was Jeremy bringing the great detail to the performance.
Yeah,
a
lot of flair.
Well, and I just wanted to congratulate you on successfully dramatizing the single stupidest thing that Holmes and Watson ever did, and taking the drugs, because that could easily have come across not exactly as intended, and instead it's just complete magic. It just works so well, and it's such a delight to watch it. So
I think interestingly, it was one of those points where because I must have read the original story so many times to just absorb it, and I do remember thinking that particular sequence, powerful as it is in the original story, in terms of television, just didn't quite work the way it was written. Now, I'm not saying for a second that I'm worthy of rewriting Conan Doyle,
sure,
but some things have to be reworked for television in order to make them credible. And I think the way we did it, and it came off the pen straight away. I didn't need to think about that very much. It just seemed to make sense the way I wrote it. And as it turned out, everyone agreed with me, and it works.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Well, just Speaking for a moment in general about the Granada group and what it was like to work with them in the future after this first script, I mean, you dealt mainly with June Wyndham Davies, right? And Michael Cox was in the producer role, but more of an executive at that point.
That's right. Yeah. When I joined, June was producing, Michael was exec producer, so he had overall responsibility for it. June had the hands-on day-to-day
Yeah.
responsibility. And I have to say that June, I mean, is mother to everyone. She was the most amazing producer, the most amazing support. She made all of this possible for me.
Mm.
And Michael is a brilliant support in his own way, but he was sort of a couple of steps removed from that process. And although he was very supportive to me later on, but June is the one who shines through.
Yeah. And what was the process like? I mean, in the later episodes, did they conscript you for particular episodes? Did you guys have some back and forth communication about which ones you might like to adapt, or how did that work out?
Well, it kind of evolved because obviously the Devil's Foot was my choice, and they were very kind enough to go along with that. The next one, Shoscombe Old Place, was offered to me, and I think that was partly on the basis that the Devil's Foot had already won the Edgar Allan Poe Award in New York in 1989, and it was that same year that Granada came to me and said, well, we're going to make another series. Michael's coming back to produce it, and we would quite like it if you could write the screenplay for Shoscombe Old Place, which was a story I knew less than many others. It's one of the latest in the canon, so one that I'd probably read fewer times. But I agreed to it, even without rereading it, because when Granada comes a-calling, you do not say no.
Yeah,
Sure.
And I was, of course, very flattered. So I reread the story and thought, well, it's quite slight. I mean, I'm sure you guys know the story anyway.
Yeah.
It has a first act and a third act, but it does not have a second act. So there was something in there that made me think, actually, this could be very exciting, because yes, I need to be faithful to the original, but I can play around with it too. There's something else I can add in. So from a writing point of view, it was quite interesting for me. So the second episode was very much offered to me as a fait accompli. Would you like to do this episode? Yes, I would. The third episode, the Golden Pince-Nez, that was at the time that ITV, all the different regional franchises were changing. The whole thing. There was a huge new bidding war going on, and all the studios had to fight for their future existence. And Granada, as part of its attempt to retain its franchise, wanted to promote a new series of Sherlock Holmes. So a few of us writers, I think there were three of us, there was Robin Chapman, Jeremy Paul and myself, and we were asked if we could put together initially ideas, but then if we could then provide the screenplays for 3 new episodes that could be used as part of that bidding process. So that's how the Golden Pince-Nez came about. And then it sat on the shelf for something like 2 years until it was decided that another series of Sherlock would be made, at which point June was then back in production. And she came to me and said, well, we've dusted off this old script. It's been sitting there for a while. We would now like to make it. But, oh, by the way, would you like to do another one? And that's how the Mazarin Stone came about. So, different ways of approaching each one. And also, actually, the Golden Pince-Nez was not the automatic choice. I wasn't told that that's the one they wanted. I was asked, which one would I like to do? So, actually, I got to choose that. I mean, the Golden Pince-Nez is a good story. I loved it. But it was down to about 2 or 3 different choices. There were a few stories that I looked at that I was quite interested in, but this was the one that won out. This was the one that the script editor I was working with at the time said, yes, that's the one we want. So I did that. The Mazarin Stone was a different kettle of fish completely, which we'll come to in a while. But
Sure.
But that was another one where I was asked which story would I like to do. So I think at that stage in my relationship with Granada Television, it was good that they were trusting me to make those choices.
Yeah.
So in the Shoscombe Old Place episode, there were some interesting casting choices, famously Robin Ellis of Poldark. What were your thoughts about those choices that were made?
Well, there were always discussions throughout the production of every episode. There were always discussions about who we might want to approach to play parts. As writers, we were always asked if we had any thoughts on the subject, because I guess since we'd already spent some time with those characters in our own heads, it made sense for the producer to get a sense of where we felt the character should be going and how we saw that person and who we might reasonably imagine playing the part,
Right.
if we had a choice. And yeah, I always had ideas about who I thought could play these different parts. And when I wrote the character of Sir Robert Norberton, the character ultimately played by Robin Ellis, I wrote the script with Oliver Reed in mind.
Wow. Yeah.
So, and the reason for that was basically the character as written by Conan Doyle is very much a kind of anti-hero character, quite dark, has a bit of a background, is not altogether regarded as a good guy. There's a lot of shadow there, but at the same time, some romance. And I thought, well, actually, I just wanted to bring that out. And I thought one way we could do that is by perhaps casting somebody best known for playing romantic hard guys, or somebody who has a history of having played those tough parts, but is also known for levels of sensitivity as well in his performances. And that's what I wanted to bring out. Never mind the fact that he's probably not short enough to be a jockey. If we wanted to emphasise the horse riding background,
Right.
But I just thought, well, what we want is somebody that we don't entirely trust to begin with, but we do feel that he's a multi-layered character. There's a lot more to him than meets the eye, and that's what emerges through the episode. And I have to say that when they told me Robin Ellis got the part, I punched the air because I just thought this is perfect.
Yeah.
He's exactly what we want.
Yeah.
And the reason I wouldn't have suggested him was because back in 1993, 1992, something like that, Poldark was still a recent memory. It was a 1970 series, but to me at that time, Robin Ellis was still Poldark.
Yeah.
So to have him come in and play this different character, but do exactly what I wanted it to do, was sensational. And Robin himself is such a gentleman.
Yeah. I am curious, just generally speaking, obviously Jeremy Brett made some changes and had some suggestions for Devil's Foot. Did he have other suggestions or changes on your later scripts? Are there things that he inserted that maybe aren't commonly known?
Not as much. And I think part of that was because, as you'll be aware, Jeremy was increasingly unwell as we made those series. So I think, although the spirit was willing, the flesh was weak, that although he wanted to have a lot more input and did have input, I think he felt that there were other pressures on him. So there was a sense that he was slightly detaching himself from that level of detail. And I did feel that he was trusting us to do our jobs. I think with The Devil's Foot, I can remember sitting in the rehearsal room, especially when we did the read-through. He would have his Bible, his Conan Doyle book, his annotated book next to him. And he would have the script on one side and the book on the other side, and he would be cross-referencing them the whole time. So, I knew that attention to detail was there throughout. That was The Devil's Foot. He did not do that for the next ones. I'd like to think that he trusted us, that we knew what we were doing. And I think that there was that element. But I think there was also the element of, well, he was a little tired and a little unwell and just wasn't as focused in quite the same way for later episodes. Nevertheless, he still channeled a huge amount of energy into it and was amazing.
Right. Well, in the Golden Pince-Nez, you ended up without a Watson due to his other commitments. At what point did you get informed of that? And was it a rush to change the script, or what was that process like? The rewrite?
Yeah, there was, because when the Golden Pince-Nez was written, as I said, that was because of the whole bidding process.
Right.
for ITV. There was a gap. There was quite a long gap between that and when we went into pre-production. When June had said, "Well, let's dust the script off and have another look at it because it's one of those that we want to produce." It was at that point where we discovered that Edward Hardwicke had, obviously a very interesting job going on elsewhere with Dickie Attenborough.
Mm-hmm.
So, he wasn't going to be available at the time we needed him to be in order to appear in this particular episode of Sherlock. I think they needed to bring the production forward. They couldn't wait until he became available, which was unfortunate because the script as written, there were some very good scenes for Watson in there. So it was a shame that we lost those because we could no longer have that character. Therefore, a lot of material that I'd invented for him just got dropped, and then I had to write new material for Mycroft, who took over, who basically became Watson for that one episode. So yeah, it was a shame. I remember I had a very nice scene for Watson. It was a kind of Cinderella-like scene where they were trying to discover the identity of the woman, the mystery woman, based on a pair of spectacles that they found. So I created a scene where Watson, almost like an optometrist, was interviewing a whole series of women of various shapes, sizes and backgrounds, wearing different types of spectacles to see if he could match them up and then what their powers of vision were and all the rest of it. So it was a comedy scene,
yeah.
But it was something that Edward Hart would have done brilliantly,
yeah.
And everyone loved the thought of it. But obviously, when the time came, we couldn't do it, so we had to drop that. But having said that, we got Charles Gray, so what's not to like?
Yeah. Yeah, there's not a better second option than that.
Absolutely, and that gave me an opportunity to create scenes that were possibly even funnier.
Yeah.
And Mycroft, he doesn't appear that often in the series, but he appears in your adaptations more than otherwise he would have. So I think the fans are actually quite pleased about that because
it's a great gift.
Yeah, everybody loves Mycroft
And Charles Gray.
Gray. Yeah.
This is the thing. In those Granada episodes, Charles Mycroft, the character of Mycroft, appears 4 times, and 2 of those are mine.
Yeah.
So, I've got 50%. That's not bad.
Yeah, exactly. And, what a brilliant connecting of the dots there with Mycroft's snuff and, changing the way that unfolded. I mean, it couldn't have been done any better. So, congratulations on how that one turned out.
Thank you. And that's one of the things that happens. When you become so engrossed in a script, it's one of those eureka moments where you just think, that works.
Right.
I could do that. And I did a similar thing with the Mazarin Stone and the cane, where we hide the diamond. So, there are little things that you can do that make more sense than Conan Doyle himself made at the time. But I would hope that wherever he's watching from, he would say, yes, that was the right thing to do.
Right.
Definitely.
I have a feeling he would. Well, a question or two about the Mazarin Stone. Obviously, that one's a combination of the 3 Garadebs and the Mazarin Stone. And I've read a lot of things that Michael Cox has had to say over the years about how they kind of front-loaded the series with all of the ones they thought were the best stories, and therefore, there were some that they thought were, if not lesser stories, maybe just not as flushed out and more difficult to bring to the screen, I guess.
Sure.
And so when it came time to do the Mazarin Stone, was that your choice to kind of combine the stories, or was that kind of an edict sent down from on high, or how did that come about?
It was an edict, basically, and I fought against it. I had no objection to the Mazarin Stone and to the 3 Garadebs as stories, and I would have been very happy to develop either of them into an hour of television. But it was June's idea, and I completely understand why she suggested it, that we should combine them. And she seemed quite keen to combine those particular 2. And, fine, we managed to work out a way of doing it, which I have to say in the original script, as opposed to what ended up on the screen, worked well. What ended up on screen didn't work quite so well, in my opinion. But having said that, I thought, well, fine, this is something that they want to do, and it's a challenge, and I'm happy to rise to a challenge. But I did, during the course of that commissioning process, I did suggest several other stories, because I just felt, well, okay, I'll see what I can do. I'll see if I can develop something from this idea, which in itself is quite interesting. But what about these? And I suggested a number of others that I felt I could more happily develop into an hour of television without having to combine two short stories.
Right.
For instance, I was really keen on His Last Bow, because there was a feeling at that time that the series probably wasn't going to run much longer. Jeremy was becoming increasingly ill. And it just seemed to me that if we were going to round it off, if we had to round it off, that His Last Bow would be a good way of doing it.
Sure.
But nevertheless, we came back to the Mazarin Stone, and I found a way of being able to combine the elements of one with the elements of another. So, it was fine. We managed that, but it wasn't an entirely satisfactory process. And, maybe I should have argued my case harder. I don't know. Like I say, I do understand their reasons for suggesting it, and we did what we could with it.
Yeah, it turns out to be definitely an interesting episode just from that point of view, but also it's obviously very visually...
It's very striking episode.
Yeah, very differently directed kind of episode. But just to back up a little bit, I mean, when you wrote the original script, though, it was written with Holmes and not Mycroft in the part, correct?
It was, yes, which is why there are sequences with Mycroft disguising himself, for instance. I mean, that was clearly lifted from the original script, where it would have been Holmes disguising himself.
Right.
Now, the other thing, a little bit of a side point on that story, but going back to casting suggestions that we talked about earlier, with the Mazarin Stone, I do remember having a conversation with June, and maybe I'd had a glass of wine or something, I don't know, but I did say to her, June, I've got a brilliant idea. I think I know exactly who can play the villain in this story. And she said, oh, go on then. What? And I said, well, Jeremy Brett. So, I had this bizarre notion that Jeremy could play both hero and villain. Because the way I was writing the script was that the character finally played by John Finch was the flip side of Sherlock Holmes. So I thought, well, actually, wouldn't it be interesting to get Jeremy slightly disguised to play both?
Yeah.
But, she just, that was blown out of the water quite quickly, because she just said, well, Jeremy's barely well enough to play one part, never mind two. We need to tread carefully with this. So, we're not going to do that.
Right.
I remember his final scene in that episode was quite haunting.
Yeah.
When Jeremy appears and he says, good job, job, brother of mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious, I mean, do you have any other Jeremy Brett stories that the audience might like to hear? I feel like any behind-the-scenes stuff that comes to mind?
Jeremy, you will hear different things about Jeremy from different people. But Jeremy was always good to me, and to this day, I'm still very fond of him. I still dream about him, funnily enough. He just pops up in my dreams occasionally. We're going to make a new episode of Sherlock Holmes, that kind of thing. So, perhaps he's out there somewhere moving me on, I don't know. But I can remember that when we were shooting The Devil's Foot, because it was a very... I only went on location for one of the 4 episodes. I attended read-throughs and rehearsals for all of them. But I'm one of those writers who feels that once you've done your job, then you should just let others get on with their jobs. So when it comes to the actual shooting of the episode, the writer is redundant. There's nothing I can do then. It has to be handed over to the director and the actors to do what they do best. So, but I can remember we were on location in Cornwall, right down on the southernmost point of Cornwall, and shooting those sequences actually where Jeremy is dreaming, when he's having this kind of paranoid episode. And while we were doing that, there was a very thick fog that came in and shrouded the whole area. So it just felt like it was us and nothing beyond the short distance that we could see around us. It was, we were just us in the world, just those small number of actors, a camera team, and nothingness. And it was so surreal. And I did talk to Jeremy about that when we got back to the hotel later on, and he said, yes, wasn't it weird? It just felt like there was nothing else going on in the world except what we were doing in that moment. And it was so lovely. But around the same time, I remember just the other side of Jeremy, that he was getting a little bit cold and a little bit tired. It was quite a harsh location. And he was, at that stage, quite keen to get back to his trailer so that he could warm up and have another cup of coffee or whatever. And I can remember at one point, the director did a take. I think it was the sequence where Jeremy had to run across the landscape in fear of his life or something. And but it didn't go quite to plan. And Jeremy just went straight back into the trailer. And the director said, well, actually, I think we need to do that again. But who's going to tell Jeremy? Because he's back in the trailer and I don't think any power on earth will get him out. So we sent, the director sent the AFM or whatever, the production manager, over to the trailer to beckon him out. And while that was happening, the director hid behind me. He just got right behind me and said, I'm not having anything to do with this. So, just pushing me forward. This is all the writer's idea. He's not happy. You're going to have to do it again. But Jeremy did it again, and he was absolutely brilliant.
Oh, that's great.
Speaking of just going back to the curious casting you've been involved in, I mean, having Mycroft when you didn't have a Watson, you also had a very young Jude Law.
Yeah, I mean, Jude had done some television prior to that, so he wasn't a complete unknown, but this was his first big piece of film television. And he was very excited about it. And I mean, of course, in those days, I didn't know who Jude Law was.
Sure.
And now everyone knows who Jude Law is. But he was lovely and, just full of enthusiasm and keen to get it right. And that particular character was one I completely invented for the story, because that's not in the original at all. And that went through a number of different versions as well. It kind of ended up being Jude Law playing a stable boy, but it did go through quite a few different versions during the development of the script before we got to that stage. But I think what we ended up with was the best thing. It worked.
Yeah, I think that one, it's nobody wants to say you've improved on Conan Doyle, but the way that one's written and presented in the story, Lady Beatrice is, she's always off camera. She's never part of the tale. It's told, in the past. But in the script, in the show, you get to know her, you get to see her. And when you make that delineation, when she stops being, alive and she starts being Jude Law, in a wig, only seen from behind, it's actually just brilliantly executed because, as from a storytelling point of view and from a viewing point of view, it's a completely different animal than it was in the written tale. And I don't know, I just, kudos to you for that, because again, that was just a great choice and just brilliantly written the way that comes across.
It really works.
It works really well.
Yeah.
That was the sort of thing that we thought a great deal about. And that's why I loved the whole use of the flashback format, of being able to skew audience perception. I have to say, of the 4 episodes I worked on, Shoscombe Old Place was the most complex in terms of keeping that mystery running, because a lot was riding on how it was shot, but Patrick Lau did a good job of shooting it in a way that maintained that mystery as well. The odd furtive look, the way that people held themselves, the way that the cameras were angled. It's just so brilliantly done, and hats off to him for that. He's a terrific director. But I have to say, just harking back to The Devil's Foot, just briefly, there was a moment in that when I was writing the script. There's a moment where one character has to look out of the window in a flashback sequence at the same time as he's telling Holmes in the present about what happened. And again, it's playing with perception, because he's telling Holmes that he saw something or sensed something outside that window. And yet in the flashback sequence as it's shot, all you see is a window. Right. So, and I think there's a little bit of rain playing on it or a tree branch outside. But that, the script indicated we want to suggest something that actually isn't there. And that's the way the director shot it. And, and I love doing that kind of thing where you think there's something there, but there isn't something there.
It's deception for the audience.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Gary, I know that your time is limited, but before we go real quick, The disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax. I know that wasn't one of your scripts, but I understand that you might have one more behind-the-scenes story about that one, something to do with a particular casting suggestion by Mr. Brett. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, what was going on at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the actors wanted to bring their friends along, and why not? People they worked with, who they trust. And, on this particular occasion, we had, what I think is a terrific story. I love that particular story. And you have this strong central female character, who in the end was played by Cheryl Campbell, who was brilliant. But in the early discussions about that particular production, this was in the series that Michael Cox was producing. It was by no means certain where we might go with the character. I didn't write that particular episode. That was, I think it was Trevor Bowen. But in the end, I can remember Michael, it was during a meeting to discuss the whole series, not just individual episodes, where he said, well, actually, I've just been on the phone to Jeremy this morning, who has said, Di Rigg is interested and I'd really love her to do it. Could you ask her to come in and do it? So, they were very serious about that, but it didn't happen for whatever reason. And I suspect it was because Di Rigg had other things going on at the time. So, very busy actress. Yeah. Who no doubt had many offers at the same time. But she would have been, no disrespect to Cheryl Campbell, Diana Rigg would have been brilliant.
Yeah, no, Cheryl Campbell is great, but that would have been very interesting. Oliver Reed would have been very interesting too, so would have been interesting to see that.
This is it. But I think what we ended up with was pretty good.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, definitely much better than pretty good. Well, Gary, I mean, really, we cannot thank you enough for taking the time to talk to us today. And maybe we can do it again sometime. But I for everything you've contributed and continue to do, thank you so much for everything.
You would be very welcome, Gus and Luke. Thank you very much for asking me. It's been a pleasure.